At 7:09 local time, the Taiwan Strait is doing what it does during the morning hours, moving traffic. The strait is 100 miles wide at its narrowest point, which sounds generous until you plot the shipping separation scheme, the territorial sea boundaries on both sides, the fishing exclusion zones, the PLA Navy exercise areas that appear and disappear from the notice to mariners, with the administrative regularity of a bureaucracy that has decided territorial ambiguity is a scheduling tool, and the specific diplomatic geometry that requires a U.S. Navy vessel transiting this body of water to remain in the international waters corridor while being sufficiently deliberate about that positioning that nobody watching could mistake the transit for anything other than what it is: a freedom of navigation operation conducted with full awareness of its own significance and zero apology for it. What remains after all that plotting is a corridor approximately 30 nautical miles wide. 30 miles of maneuvering room for a destroyer doing 15 knots in a strait, where the political stakes of every course change are logged, photographed, and distributed to approximately 11 different audiences before the ship's wake has settled. USS Chung-Hoon, hull number DDG-93, an Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer, is making 15 knots on a northbound transit through the Strait's international waters corridor. The morning watch section has been managing 2 commercial container vessels in the southbound lane, a Taiwanese Coast Guard patrol craft paralleling to the east, and a cluster of PLA Navy surface assets to the west that the intelligence brief describes, with the patience of people who have described this cluster many times as conducting observation operations, the diplomatic language for ships that are watching you watch them. Present since 4:47, not moving aggressively, not communicating, watching. This is in the Taiwan Strait, the baseline. On the bridge, the officer of the deck is managing the strait transit with the heightened attention that strait transits require. More traffic, more political sensitivity, more vectors of interest converging on a single corridor. And the coffee that he has been drinking since 5:30 is the 4th cup of a morning that started early and shows no sign of concluding without incident. The first 3 cups were strategic. This one is structural. He is watching the contacts with the professional care of a person who has been briefed extensively on this transit and has internalized the specific instruction that applies to every Taiwan Strait freedom of navigation operation conducted by the 7th Fleet, which is document everything, communicate nothing that does not need to be communicated, and proceed on track. At 7:09, a new contact appeared on the radar. Not from the PLA Navy cluster to the west. From the north, large, fast for a ship of its apparent size, bearing 180, inbound on USS Chung-Hoon's track. The officer of the deck noted it. He noted the size return, larger than the destroyer, considerably larger, and the closure rate, which was approximately 22 knots on a direct reciprocal heading that, if maintained, would place the contact across the Chung-Hoon's bow at approximately 0.4 nautical miles in 14 minutes. He called the tactical action officer. He did not stop watching the contact. The vessel was China Coast Guard ship 5901. At 10,000 tons displacement, it is one of the largest Coast Guard vessels operating anywhere on the planet. Longer than a U.S. Navy Ticonderoga class cruiser, wider than most of the commercial traffic sharing the strait, and armed, in the specific sense that matters here, with water cannons. The 5901 is a genuine giant and an operational fact of life in the Taiwan Strait. It is also armed with water cannons. This point is worth repeating not for emphasis, but for precision. because the specific capability gap between a 10,000-ton vessel that carries water cannons and a 9,200-ton vessel that carries the Aegis Combat System, the SM-2 Block 3B surface-to-air missile, the MK 45 5-inch gun, the Phalanx close-in weapon system, the MK 46 torpedo system, and 16 Tomahawk cruise missiles in its forward vertical launch cells, is a gap that does not require further elaboration, but does require acknowledgement, because the 5901's crew was apparently operating with a briefing that did not foreground it. The CCG 5901 had departed its patrol position at approximately 6:51, 18 minutes before it appeared on USS Chung-Hoon's scope, from a holding area approximately 22 nautical miles to the north. The departure had been logged by the Taiwanese Coast Guard vessel paralleling the transit, which had its own radar picture and its own communication channel to the Chung-Hoon's command structure that the PLA Navy's observation cluster presumably knew about and had presumably factored into its assessment, which raises interesting questions about what the assessment concluded, none of which have answers that reflect well on the assessment. The 5901's course and speed placed it on a direct intercept with the Chung-Hoon's transit track. The geometry was deliberate. The intent was unambiguous. Here is the vulnerability that the CCG 5901's operational planners had identified correctly and were attempting to exploit. And here is why identifying it correctly turned out to be the most useful thing they contributed to the morning. The Taiwan Strait's International Waters Corridor, 30 nautical miles wide as established, contains within it the practical maneuvering constraint that the southbound commercial traffic lane runs along its western edge and the Taiwanese territorial sea boundary runs along its eastern edge, leaving USS Chung-Hoon operating in an effective maneuvering corridor of approximately 18 nautical miles. 18 miles sounds comfortable for a guided missile destroyer. 18 miles is comfortable for a guided missile destroyer doing routine transits. 18 miles becomes less comfortable when a 10,000-ton vessel is proceeding south at 22 knots on a reciprocal bearing with apparent intent to contest the right-of-way, because the rules of the road, the international regulations for preventing collisions at sea, which apply to both military and civilian vessels and which are not suspended by political claims of sovereignty, regardless of what Beijing's official position on the Taiwan Strait's legal status might be, establish a specific hierarchy of obligation when two power-driven vessels approach head-on. The rules of the road say both vessels alter course to starboard in a head-on situation. Both, not one, both. The CCG 5901 was not altering course to starboard. The CCG 5901 was maintaining its southbound heading with the deliberate commitment of a vessel whose commanding officer had been briefed to maintain the heading and had understood that maintaining it was the operational objective. The Chung-Hoon's officer of the deck was watching a 10,000-ton ship decline to comply with the rules of the road at a closure rate that was eating the available reaction time at 22 knots of relative approach. This is the specific discomfort of an encounter that is not a military confrontation. The CCG carries no weapons that can threaten the Chung-Hoon, but is a seamanship problem of the precise type that produces collisions when one party declines to follow the rules that prevent them. The commanding officer was on the bridge at 7:13. He had been called at 7:10 before the situation had fully resolved into what it was becoming, and had arrived with the focused economy of a senior officer who has transited this strait before and has opinions about the specific category of situation that requires his presence on the bridge as opposed to his attention from the chart table. He looked at the contact. He looked at the range. 11 nautical miles, closure rate bringing it down roughly every 30 seconds. He looked at the commercial traffic to the west. He looked at the Taiwanese territorial sea to the east. He said 3 words to the officer of the deck that were not a question. Bridge to bridge, Channel 16. The officer of the deck transmitted on Channel 16, identifying USS Chung-Hoon, stating its position and course, and calling the oncoming vessel to clarify its intentions per the international regulations for preventing collisions at sea. This is documented procedure. It creates a record. It gives the approaching vessel the opportunity to respond in the standard maritime framework before the options narrow. The CCG 5901 responded on Channel 16 in Mandarin. The translation, provided by the Watch Section's linguist, within 40 seconds, stated that the China Coast Guard vessel was conducting a lawful patrol operation in Chinese jurisdictional waters, and that USS Chung-Hoon was operating without authorization in Chinese sovereign waters and should alter course immediately to clear the area. The response was delivered in the professional tone of a vessel that had been given a script and was delivering it with commitment. It did not acknowledge the rules of the road query. It did not state an intention to alter course. This is the specific operational design of the CCG intercept approach in the Taiwan Strait. The CCG vessel is too large to ignore, too deliberately positioned to dismiss, and equipped in a way that makes it legally a Coast Guard vessel rather than a military asset, which places it in a category that requires a different response framework than a PLA Navy warship would require. The intent is to force USS Chung-Hoon to alter course, starboard toward the Taiwanese territorial sea boundary, or port toward the commercial traffic, and produce footage of the course alteration that can be characterized as the American vessel departing Chinese sovereign waters under CCG assertion of authority. The script is clear. The geometry was chosen to make executing the script seem straightforward. The geometry did not account for 2 things. The first was the Taiwanese Coast Guard vessel, which was logging the encounter on its own systems and providing a parallel track to the Chung-Hoon's command structure. The second was what the encounter was generating for USS Chung-Hoon's electronic systems, which were running and collecting from the moment the CCG 5901 appeared on scope. Short sentences. Because at 7:17, the range was 6 nautical miles and the closure rate had not changed. The commanding officer looked at the range. He looked at the commercial traffic. The southbound container vessel was at 4 nautical miles to the west and tracking clear of the immediate situation. He looked at the Taiwanese territorial sea boundary bearing to the east. He looked at the 5901's track, which had not deviated by a single degree since it appeared at 7:09. Then he did something that was, in the specific vocabulary of straight navigation, exactly the correct thing, and also in the specific vocabulary of this channel's operational narrative, the most insulting possible response to a 10,000-ton vessel that had spent 18 minutes positioning for an intercept. All ahead standard. Come right 3 degrees. Maintain track 3 degrees. Not a course change. A minor heading adjustment within the transit track corridor, entirely consistent with the right-of-way obligations of the burdened vessel in a head-on situation. USS Chung-Hoon had gone 3 degrees to starboard per the rules of the road and was continuing its track. The 5901 was now required, under the same rules of the road, to make the corresponding starboard adjustment that the head-on rule requires of both vessels. The CCG 5901 had not been briefed to make a corresponding starboard adjustment. The CCG 5901 was briefed to hold course until the American destroyer altered course significantly. 3 degrees is not a significant course alteration. 3 degrees is the navigational equivalent of a polite but extremely deliberate statement that you have read the rules, you have followed them to the letter, and the next move is yours, and the rules of the road are watching. The 5901 held. Range, 5 nautical miles. Closure still at 22 knots. Photograph and log the contact. Maintain channel 16 guard. The commanding officer's voice had the quality of someone dictating into a record rather than managing a crisis, which he was. At 7:21, with the range at 3.8 nautical miles, the CCG 5901 altered course. Not a dramatic alteration, a gradual 12-degree turn to its own starboard, which opened the approach angle from head-on to a passing geometry at approximately 600 yards on USS Chung-Hoon's port side. The pass was deliberate. The 600-yard distance was deliberate. At 600 yards, a 10,000-ton vessel is visible in considerable detail. Its crew on the bridge wing is visible with binoculars. Its water cannon emplacements are visible. Its paint scheme, hull number, and the specific configuration of its superstructure are visible and documentable with the Chung-Hoon's photographic systems, which had been documenting since 7:09 without pause. The 5901 passed at 600 yards. At a relative speed of approximately 37 knots combined, the Chung-Hoon northbound at 15, the 5901 now southbound at 22, the pass lasted approximately 90 seconds of visual contact range. In those 90 seconds, the Chung-Hoon systems collected the following. The 5901's navigation radar emissions, now cataloged against the vessel's hull number in the Pacific Fleet Contact Database. The CCG vessel's internal communications, transmitted on a frequency that the Electronic Support Measures Suite had identified and locked in the first 30 seconds after the contact appeared on scope. The 5901's thermal profile from the passive infrared system logged against the vessel type for future detection optimization. And from the signal intelligence collection, running continuously since 7:09, the command net transmission that had occurred at 7:19, 2 minutes before the course alteration, in which the 5901's commanding officer had communicated with the shoreside CCG command cell on a frequency the collection database had seen before, in a transmission pattern that was becoming familiar, requesting and receiving authorization to proceed to the passing geometry, rather than continuing the head-on approach. That last item is the most operationally interesting piece of collected intelligence from the encounter, because it revealed something about the CCG's decision-making process under pressure that the collection community had been trying to characterize for 8 months. The 5901 had been briefed to hold course. At 3.8 nautical miles, with USS Chung-Hoon having made exactly the minimum required rules of the road adjustment and no more, the 5901's commanding officer had requested a change in instructions. The shoreside command cell had authorized the change. The authorization had come in 47 seconds. This sequence, hold, request, authorize, alter, described the command relationship between an operating CCG vessel and its shoreside control node in a way that no previous intercept collection had captured with this timing resolution. The 47-second authorization window, the specific frequency on which it was requested, and the transmission pattern of the response were all in the collection package before the 5901 finished its pass. On the weather deck, a boatswain's mate who had been on lookout detail since 600 watched the 5901 pass at 600 yards with the professional attention of a person whose job is to watch things and report them. The vessel was large, genuinely impressively large, the kind of large that makes you recalibrate your sense of scale at sea. He noted the water cannons, 1 forward and 2 aft. He noted the crew visible on the bridge wing, watching the Chung-Hoon with binoculars, in the same way he was watching them with binoculars. He raised his hand in a brief, entirely neutral wave, of the type that acknowledges another vessel's crew, without communicating anything beyond the acknowledgement. Then he picked up his notebook and logged the 5901's hull number, which was clearly readable at 600 yards, and the time of closest point of approach, which was 7:22 and 18 seconds, and returned his attention to the forward sector, because the transit was not over, and the forward sector required watching. Now, the intelligence picture from the full encounter, which ran from 7:09 to approximately 7:35 when the 5901 cleared the Chung-Hoon's aft sector and continued south. The AN/SLQ-32 electronic warfare suite had been building the 5901's electronic profile from the moment of first radar contact. The vessel's navigation radar emissions and Furuno-type commercial maritime navigation radar, standard fit for large CCG vessels, broadcasting on X-band with a signal profile that the SLQ-32 had cataloged across 9 previous CCG interactions in the Strait, were in the collection log before the commanding officer arrived on the bridge. More interesting was the communication intercept. The 5901 had maintained contact with 3 separate entities during the encounter: the shoreside CCG command cell, a PLA Navy coordination frequency that the collection database had seen in previous Strait transits associated with PLA Navy surface group coordination, and a third frequency that was new, a transmission pattern that appeared twice, briefly, during the encounter, and that the collection team flagged for analysis, because its characteristics were inconsistent with either of the first 2 contacts, and consistent with something the database had not previously associated with CCG operations in this geographic area. The third frequency was flagged, packaged, forwarded to Pacific Fleet Signals Intelligence with a priority notation. What it represented, whether a new command node, a coordination link with a different organization, or a technical anomaly, would require analysis time that the collection team did not have during the transit. But the flag was in the system. The data was in the package. The encounter had lasted 26 minutes and had produced a third frequency identification that had not existed in the CCG Strait contact database before 7:09. The Taiwanese Coast Guard vessel's parallel log of the encounter was transmitted to USS Chung-Hoon's command structure at 7:40, 5 minutes after the 5901 cleared the area. The log confirmed the timeline, the approach geometry, and the 5901's course alteration at 3.8 nautical miles. It also included the Taiwanese vessel's own photographic record of the encounter, which covered the approach from a different angle than the Chung-Hoon's cameras, and provided a perspective on the 5901's bridge wing configuration that the Chung-Hoon's cameras, looking port, had not captured in the same detail. 2 independent records, 2 camera angles, 1 incident. The records were correlated, packaged, and forwarded to 7th Fleet within the hour. "What's the final intel package look like?" the executive officer asked at 7:45. "Navigation radar profile, confirmed current against hole number 5901, ma'am. Command net frequency updated for the shoreside CCG control node. The 47-second authorization window is document, timing, and frequency. The third frequency contact is flagged for analysis. Priority notation, going to PACOM Signals Intelligence." The collection operator paused. "And we have the Taiwanese Coast Guard's parallel record for cross-correlation. Their camera angle covers the 5901's bridge wing configuration that our cameras didn't cover from that angle. Outstanding." The executive officer made a note. It was longer than usual. "What did they actually accomplish?" The tactical action officer had been listening. "They produced footage of an intercept and a course change, ma'am. Our 3-degree starboard adjustment for the rules of the road. They're calling a 3-degree rules of the road adjustment a course change. They will, ma'am. Yes, the executive officer looked at this for 1 second. She wrote something else in her log. The something else was brief. It was the appropriate length. Here is the accounting that the CCG 5901's mission debrief would not include in its favorable summary of the morning. The vessel had positioned for an intercept, proceeded on a collision course for 12 minutes, received a rules of the road adjustment of 3 degrees from the target vessel, requested authorization from its shore command at 3.8 nautical miles, received authorization in 47 seconds, and executed a passing geometry at 600 yards. The shoreside command relationship had been documented in real time, including frequency, transmission timing, and the specific decision point at which a held position becomes an authorized alteration. The navigation radar had been cataloged. The third frequency had been flagged and was in the PACOM signals intelligence queue. The Taiwanese parallel record provided a camera angle the Chung-Hoon had not covered. The CCG 5901 had come to force a course change and generate footage of an American destroyer departing Chinese sovereign waters. It had gotten 3 degrees. 3 degrees that the rules of the road required and that were documented in the Chung-Hoon's log as exactly that, a rules of the road adjustment during a head-on approach, and that would appear in the footage as something a creative narrator could characterize differently. The creative narration was predictable. It was also, at this point in the operating relationship between the two navies in this strait, essentially pre-written. By 10:30 local time, CCTV had a segment. The China Coast Guard had conducted a successful sovereignty protection operation in the Taiwan Strait, demonstrating the capability and resolve of the Chinese Coast Guard to assert the People's Republic of China's jurisdictional authority over Chinese sovereign waters. The footage showed the CCG 5901, genuinely enormous, genuinely impressive on camera, in close proximity to USS Chung-Hoon, which appeared small and somewhat uncertain in the wide frame. A commentator noted that the American vessel had altered course. This was accurate. The segment did not note that the alteration was 3 degrees, or that it was a rules of the road compliance maneuver, or that the CCG vessel had altered course 12 degrees at 3.8 nautical miles, which is a course alteration approximately 4 times larger than the one being characterized as a retreat. The segment was 9 minutes long. The production values were professional. The narrative was complete within the information available to it. USS Chung-Hoon's deck log read 7:09 to 7:35, CCG 5901 intercept approach, head-on geometry, channel 16, contact made 7:13, ROE compliant 3-degree starboard adjustment, 7:17, CCG 5901 course alteration, 7:21, CPA 600 yards port beam 7:22, contact cleared aft sector 7:35, no deviation from authorized transit corridor, full electronic collection throughout, no damage, no personnel losses. The incident report was 7 pages. The intelligence annex was 4 pages, including the 3rd frequency flag and the 47-second authorization window analysis. The Taiwanese Coast Guard correlation log was attached as a separate appendix. The transit continued. USS Chung-Hoon cleared the northern end of the strait at 11:14. The political temperature in the strait, which had been elevated since before the transit began, remained elevated because the political temperature in the Taiwan Strait is not responsive to individual transit outcomes in the way that a thermostat is responsive to a room's actual temperature. It is responsive to longer-term variables that individual transits do not resolve. What individual transits do is document. Document the corridor, document the contacts, document the CCG's command relationship with its shore control node, document the 47-second authorization window, and document the third frequency contact that the PACOM signals intelligence team would spend the next 4 days characterizing, and that would eventually, in the specific way that intelligence accumulates across many small contributions, tell the collection community something it did not know before 7:09 on a Tuesday in the Taiwan Strait. The boatswain's mate completed his lookout rotation at 8 o'clock. He had logged 6 contacts, including the 5901, with times, bearings, and the hull numbers readable at visual range. His log was incorporated into the incident report. It was accurate. It was detailed. It was the work of a professional who had been told to watch things and report them, and had done exactly that, and had found the 10,000-ton vessel at 600 yards, approximately as remarkable as the job required and no more, which is the correct amount of remarkable to find things when you are a lookout on a guided missile destroyer transiting the Taiwan Strait on a Tuesday. Both documents, the CCTV segment and the Chung-Hoon's incident report, are records of the same 26 minutes in the same body of water. One of them will be played for a domestic audience 11 times before lunch. The other will be read by analysts who will update a database entry, flag a frequency, and note a 47-second window that was, before 7:09, an unknown quantity. The strait was 100 miles wide. The corridor was 30 miles. The course change was 3 degrees. The authorization window was 47 seconds. And before this morning, it had not been measured. Bye for now.